The sun dipped below the horizon in Carmel, California, painting the sky in warm hues of orange and purple. Clint Eastwood sat on the porch of his ranch, a cup of black coffee in hand, gazing over the quiet landscape. He had seen a lot in his lifetime: fame, success, and the changing tides of Hollywood. But tonight, a different feeling settled over him. The distant growl of an engine pulled him from his thoughts. Squinting toward the driveway, he watched as a sleek, black SUV rolled in. The door swung open, and out stepped a tall, well-dressed young man, Barron Trump. At 6'7", he was an imposing presence, yet his movements were composed and respectful. "Mr. Eastwood," Barron greeted with a warm smile. "Or should I say Godfather?" Clint smirked. "You're the only one who still calls me that." Over the years, Barron's visits had been rare, but their connection remained strong. Clint had been named his godfather as a token of respect between two families, and despite the passing time, Barron had never forgotten. Barron gestured toward the SUV. "I brought something for you." Clint raised an eyebrow. "You bought me a car?" "Not just any car," Barron replied, opening the door. "Come take a look." With some effort, Clint pushed himself up from his chair and approached the vehicle. He was never one to be impressed easily, but as he stepped closer, he realized this was something special. The SUV was custom-built, blending classic American muscle with modern luxury. The matte black exterior, the bold grille, and the subtle engraving of CE on the dashboard told him this wasn't just a gift, it was a tribute. "I had it designed with you in mind," Barron explained. "Tough, timeless, and built to last, just like you." Clint ran a hand over the leather seats, nodding in approval. "Hell of a machine," he muttered. Barron hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "You've been more than just a name to me," he admitted. "My father always admired your work ethic, your discipline, your ability to stay true to yourself. You inspired him, and you've inspired me too." Clint studied Barron for a moment. The boy he had once known had grown into a man with a quiet strength and a path of his own to walk. "I wanted to give you something that showed my appreciation," Barron continued. "Not just for what you've done in the movies, but for the kind of man you are." Clint exhaled, his usual tough exterior softening just a bit. He had spent his life playing strong, silent characters, but this moment didn't require an act. He placed a firm hand on Barron's shoulder. "You didn't have to do this, kid," Clint said, his voice steady. "But I appreciate it, more than you know." Barron smiled. "You always said actions speak louder than words." Clint smirked. "Damn right." For a moment they stood there in silence, letting the moment settle between them. Then, with a twinkle in his eye, Clint slid into the driver's seat. "Let's take this beast for a spin," he said. Barron laughed and climbed into the passenger seat. As the engine rumbled to life, Clint felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: a rush of pure joy. As they drove down the winding roads of Carmel, the evening sky stretched before them, the past and future meeting in a moment of unspoken respect. A legend and a rising force bound by wisdom, gratitude, and an unbreakable bond. For the first time in years, Clint Eastwood didn't just feel like a Hollywood icon. He felt like a man who had truly made a difference. As the SUV glided smoothly down the winding roads of Carmel, Clint gripped the wheel, feeling the weight of time slip away. The power beneath his hands, the roar of the engine. It reminded him of the old days, when he'd hit the open road without a care. He stole a glance at Barron, who was watching him with quiet amusement. "You look like a kid in a candy store," Barron teased. Clint chuckled. "Haven't driven something this good in a long time." Barron nodded. "Figured you might appreciate it. The team that built it made sure it had that classic American feel. No unnecessary gadgets, just pure strength and precision." Clint tapped the dashboard approvingly. "That's how a car should be. No nonsense." They drove in comfortable silence for a while, the headlights cutting through the dimming twilight. Clint felt a strange but welcome sense of peace. He had spent decades in Hollywood navigating egos, politics, and the highs and lows of fame. But here, in this moment, it was just him, the road, and a young man who had taken the time to show his gratitude. After a while, Clint pulled over at a scenic overlook. The Pacific stretched out before them, waves crashing against the rocky cliffs. He shut off the engine and leaned back in his seat. Barron broke the silence. "Can I ask you something?" Clint nodded. "Shoot." "What's the one thing you'd tell someone my age to remember? About life, success, everything?" Clint exhaled, staring out at the horizon. "Don't let the world tell you who you are. Make that choice yourself. And once you do, stick to it." Barron considered his words, nodding slowly. "That's solid advice." Clint smirked. "Damn right it is." Barron grinned. "You ever regret anything?" Clint was quiet for a moment, then shook his head. "Regrets are a waste of time. You live, you learn, you move forward." He glanced at Barron. "You've got a lot ahead of you. Just make sure you're the one steering the wheel." Barron nodded, taking it all in. As the sky turned darker, Clint restarted the engine. "Come on, kid, let's get back." As they drove back to the ranch, the bond between them felt stronger than ever. The ride hadn't just been about a car. It had been about respect, legacy, and the passing of wisdom from one generation to the next. And for Clint Eastwood, it was a reminder that even in the twilight of his years, he still had something to give. As they neared Clint's ranch, the night had fully settled in, the moon casting a soft glow over the quiet countryside. The ride had been more than just a drive. It had been a moment of reflection, an unspoken passing of the torch. Clint wasn't one for long-winded speeches, but he could feel the weight of the night settling in his chest. Pulling up to the house, Clint cut the engine and let the silence hang between them for a moment. Barron turned to him, sensing there was something left unsaid. "You know," Clint finally said, his voice steady but thoughtful, "people spend their whole lives chasing something. Money, fame, power. Most of them don't realize until it's too late that none of that matters." He tapped a calloused finger against the steering wheel. "What matters is the kind of man you become." Barron listened intently, his expression serious. "You're going to have a lot of voices telling you who you should be," Clint continued. "Ignore them. Trust yourself, work hard, and don't ever forget where you came from." Barron nodded, slowly. "That's what I've been trying to do. But sometimes it feels like no matter what path I choose, people already have their minds made up about me." Clint let out a dry chuckle. "That's life, kid. They'll always have something to say. You just gotta make damn sure you don't live for their approval." Barron exhaled, leaning back in his seat. "That's easier said than done." Clint turned to him, a knowing look in his eyes. "If it were easy, everyone would do it." Barron let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head. "You really don't sugarcoat anything, do you?" Clint smirked. "Never have, never will." The two sat in silence for a moment longer before Barron finally reached for the door handle. "I should let you get some rest, but thank you for everything." Clint nodded, watching as Barron stepped out of the SUV. Just before he closed the door, Clint called out, "You ever need a reminder of who you are? Just take this thing for a ride. Roads have a way of clearing the mind." Barron grinned. "I'll remember that." With that, he closed the door and stepped back, watching as Clint gave one last approving nod before heading inside. As Barron got back into his own vehicle, he sat for a moment, thinking about everything Clint had said. The world could try to define him, but in the end, the only thing that truly mattered was the man he chose to be. And tonight, he had been reminded of exactly the kind of man he wanted to become. As Barron pulled out of the driveway, the SUV's headlights cutting through the darkness, he took one last glance at the ranch in his rearview mirror. He had come here to surprise Clint with a gift, but in the end he had walked away with something far more valuable: wisdom. The drive back was quiet, the hum of the engine steady as his mind replayed Clint's words. "Don't let the world tell you who you are. Make that choice yourself." It was simple advice, yet it carried a weight he hadn't fully grasped until now. Back at the ranch, Clint stood by the window, watching the taillights disappear down the road. He took a slow sip of his coffee, now cold, but he didn't mind. Tonight had been different. It wasn't often he found himself looking back, But Barron's visit had stirred something in him. He had seen countless men rise and fall in Hollywood, in politics, in life. Some had stayed true to themselves, while others had been swallowed by the expectations of the world. Clint had always prided himself on knowing exactly who he was, never bending for anyone. But he also knew how hard it could be for a young man in Barron's position. He set his cup down, glancing toward the sleek SUV parked outside. It was a fine gift, one he hadn't expected, but what meant more to him was the respect behind it. Barron hadn't come to impress him with wealth or status. He had come as a young man looking for guidance, looking to understand what it truly meant to carve out his own legacy. With a small, knowing smile, Clint turned off the porch light and headed inside. He had spent a lifetime as the tough guy, the lone gunslinger, the man who didn't need anyone. But tonight, he felt something different. Maybe it was the quiet satisfaction of knowing he had left something behind, not just in film, but in the lessons he had passed down. As he settled into his chair, he thought about the road ahead, not just for himself, but for Barron. The world would always have its opinions, but Clint had no doubt that the young man would find his own way. And when he did, he'd do it with the same grit and determination that had defined the Eastwood name for decades. The night stretched on, calm and still, as Clint closed his eyes, feeling for the first time in a long while that his work wasn't quite done yet. The morning sun crept over the horizon, casting golden light through the windows of Clint's ranch. He stirred awake in his chair, the warmth of a well-rested night settling into his bones. As he stretched, his eyes drifted toward the sleek SUV parked outside. A faint smile tugged at the corners of his lips. There was something about the vehicle that reminded him of himself, rugged, timeless, built for the long haul. He ran a hand through his silver hair and let out a slow breath. Maybe it was just a car, but the meaning behind it was what mattered. Barron had thought of him, not as a Hollywood legend, not as a political voice, but as a man who had lived a life worth learning from. The thought lingered as he stepped onto the porch, his boots crunching against the wooden boards. He took in the crisp morning air, the kind that made a man feel alive, and ran a hand along the SUV's hood. Solid, reliable, just the way he liked things. Then, an idea struck him. He turned on his heel and stepped back inside, reaching for his phone. Dialing a number he hadn't used in a while, he listened to the ringing before a familiar voice picked up. "Didn't expect to hear from you this early," Barron said, his voice carrying a hint of amusement. Clint smirked. "You busy today, kid?" Barron hesitated. "Not really. Why?" Clint leaned against the counter. "How about you come back out here? We're going to take that machine of yours on a proper test run." Barron chuckled. "You sure you're up for it?" "Hell, I might be old, but I still know my way around. A wheel." Clint paused. "Besides, got a few more things to teach you." Barron didn't hesitate this time. "I'm on my way." Clint hung up, feeling a rare sense of anticipation. He had spent years being the man others looked up to, but it had been a long time since he had taken the time to pass down what he'd learned. Maybe today was about more than just a drive. Maybe it was about making sure the next generation understood what it really meant to stand tall, stay true, and keep pushing forward, no matter what the world threw at you. As the distant hum of an approaching engine reached his ears, Clint smiled to himself. Some things were worth passing down. As Clint stood on the porch, the faint roar of an engine grew louder. Moments later, Barron's SUV rolled up the driveway, smooth and steady, just like the young man behind the wheel. The vehicle came to a halt and Barron stepped out dressed casually in a fitted jacket and boots. Practical, just like his godfather. "Figured you'd call," Barron said with a knowing grin. Clint smirked. "Did you now?" Barron nodded. "Something told me you weren't done just yet." Clint chuckled. "Damn right." He gestured toward the SUV. "Keys." Barron tossed them over without hesitation. "Where to?" Clint caught them effortlessly and slid into the driver's seat. "You'll see." Barron climbed into the passenger side, watching as Clint adjusted his grip on the wheel. There was something different about the way he handled it, not just with control, but with a certain reverence. This wasn't just a test drive. This was a lesson. With a deep, steady breath, Clint turned the key, bringing the engine to life. With a low, throaty growl. Then, without another word, he pressed down on the gas and they were off. The roads of Carmel stretched before them, winding along cliffs and open plains. Clint navigated them with the ease of a man who had spent a lifetime in control, not just of machines, but of himself. Barron watched him closely. "You still love the road, don't you?" Clint nodded. "Always have. A man's gotta have something that makes him feel free. Some find it in power, some in money. Me? I always found it in the open road." Barron took in his words, letting them settle. "And what about now?" Clint exhaled, his gaze fixed ahead. "Now? It's about making sure the right things live on." He glanced at Barron. "You got a lot ahead of you. More eyes on you than most men ever have to deal with. But at the end of the day, none of that matters if you don't know who you are." Barron nodded slowly. "That's what you meant last night." Clint smirked. "Takes a while to sink in, doesn't it?" Barron chuckled. "Yeah, but I get it now." They drove on in silence for a while, the rhythmic hum of the engine filling the space between them. Then Clint made an unexpected turn onto a rugged dirt road leading toward the hills. "Where are we going?" Barron asked, gripping the handle as the SUV rumbled over uneven terrain. Clint's eyes gleamed with mischief. "A place I used to go when I needed to clear my head." Barron sat back, trusting the old man's instincts. The road twisted and climbed until they reached an overlook, high above the valley. Clint killed the engine and stepped out, Barron following suit. The view was breathtaking, rolling hills stretching for miles, untouched by the noise of the world. Clint took a deep breath, letting the crisp air fill his lungs. Every man needs a place like this. As Barron gripped the wheel and guided the SUV back down the winding dirt road, he felt a newfound confidence settle over him. Clint sat in the passenger seat, arms crossed, his eyes scanning the road ahead with the quiet intensity he was known for. "You drive like a man who thinks too much," Clint remarked. Barron smirked. "That a bad thing?" Clint shook his head. "Not always, but out here, you gotta feel the road, not overthink it." Barron took the advice to heart, loosening his grip just slightly, letting the vehicle move with the terrain instead of against it. As the SUV smoothed out over the uneven path, Clint gave a small nod of approval. "Better," he said. Barron glanced at him. "You ever get tired of giving lessons?" Clint chuckled. "Not when I think they'll actually stick." They made their way back onto the main road, the ocean coming into view in the distance. Barron settled into the drive, the hum of the engine filling the quiet between them once again. But something in the air had shifted. This wasn't just about cars or roads anymore. After a while, Barron finally spoke. "You ever regret anything?" Clint turned his gaze toward the young man, studying him for a moment. He could tell the question ran deeper than just curiosity. "Everyone's got regrets, kid," Clint said. "The trick is making sure you don't let them weigh you down." Barron nodded, gripping the wheel a little tighter. "My whole life, people have had expectations for me. They don't see me as my own person. Just a name, a legacy I didn't ask for." Clint sighed, leaning back in his seat. "That's the price of being born into something bigger than yourself. But here's the thing. You don't owe the world a damn thing. Not your name, not your future. You get to decide what your story." Barron let that sink in. "And if I screw it up?" Clint smirked. "Then you get back up, dust yourself off, and keep going. No one gets through life clean, kid. But the ones who matter, they don't quit." Barron didn't answer right away. He just stared at the road ahead, the weight of Clint's words settling in his chest. For the first time in a long time, he felt something he hadn't expected. Clarity. The SUV rolled into Clint's driveway, the ride coming to an end. Barron put it in park and exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "Hell of a morning." Clint grinned. "Told you I had more to teach you." Barron turned to him, a look of quiet gratitude in his eyes. "Thanks, Godfather." Clint patted the dashboard. "You ever need another lesson, you know where to find me." Barron nodded, stepping out of the SUV. He took one last look at the legendary man beside him, realizing that this wasn't just a visit. It was a moment that would shape the road ahead. As he climbed into his own car and started the engine, he glanced back at Clint, who stood on the porch watching him with that same knowing smirk. Barron gave him a nod before pulling away, the road stretching out before him. And for the first time, he wasn't worried about where it would lead, because now he knew he was the one in the driver's seat. As Barron's car disappeared down the road, Clint stood there for a while, hands in his pockets, staring after him. The wind rustled through the trees, the only sound breaking the stillness of the morning. He had met a lot of men in his lifetime, some strong, some weak, some who knew exactly who they were and others still trying to figure it out. Barron was young, but he wasn't lost. He was just searching, like everyone else. And Clint had a feeling that, after today, the kid would find his way. With a quiet chuckle, Clint turned and made his way back inside. He poured himself another cup of coffee and sat down by the window, staring out at the SUV Barron had gifted him. It was a damn fine machine, but it wasn't the car that mattered. It was the gesture behind it, a sign of respect. A sign that the lessons Clint had lived by weren't fading away with time. He took a slow sip of coffee, then grabbed his phone. He hesitated for just a second before dialing a number from his past. After a few rings, a familiar voice answered. "Well, if it isn't the old man himself," the voice said with a laugh. Clint smirked. "Still talking like you're any younger than me, Reynolds." Burt Reynolds had been gone for years, but Clint swore he could still hear his old friend's voice whenever he got behind the wheel of a classic car. Shaking his head, he muttered to himself, "Guess I'm getting sentimental in my old age." But maybe that wasn't such a bad thing. He leaned back in his chair, letting the warmth of the sun wash over him. Life had been a long road, one filled with victories, regrets, and everything in between. But sitting there with a damn fine car outside and the echoes of a meaningful conversation still fresh in his mind, Clint Eastwood felt something rare: content. The road ahead might be shorter than the one behind, but he'd be damned if he didn't enjoy every last mile. As Clint sat there, lost in thought, a knock at the door pulled him back to the present. He wasn't expecting anyone. With a groan, he set his coffee down and made his way to the door, opening it to find a familiar figure standing there. Barron. Clint raised an eyebrow. "That was a quick trip. Forgot something?" Barron smirked. "Not exactly." Clint crossed his arms. "Then what brings you back?" Barron glanced past him, his eyes settling on the SUV. "You said you had more to teach me." Clint studied him for a long moment, then let out a quiet chuckle. "Didn't think you'd catch on that fast." Barron shrugged. "Guess I'm a quick learner." Clint stepped aside, motioning for him to come in. "All right, kid. Let's see if you're ready for lesson 2. Barron stepped inside, and as the door closed behind them, Clint couldn't help but smile. Maybe the road ahead wasn't just about looking back on the past. Maybe it was about passing the torch.